There's been a recent increase in protests in China. And the most recent protests had erupted after a fire broke out in an apartment building in the city of Urumqi. Residents had been physically locked in their homes for 4 months. Firefighters were said to have not been let in to suppress the fire because of COVID protocols. When they actually did reach the apartment, many online indicated that they couldn't even access the building because of locked doors. At least 10 people died in the fires. As we see in Iran, the death of one person can spark nearly a revolution, but Iran and China are completely different, and both conflicts are ongoing. When we look at China, we tend only to understand it partially because we look at it through Western eyes. In this video, I'll explain the 5 things that you need to understand about the protests in China and whether they could amount to anything that will impact you directly.
Download the Start Preparing Survival Guide to help you prepare for any disaster. I'll post a link in the description and comments section below, or visit cityprepping.com/get started for a free guide to help you get started on your journey of preparedness.
Number 1. What is China's zero COVID policy? The first thing to understand is the zero COVID policy itself. China is following a policy it calls Dynamic Zero, taking action wherever COVID flares up to eradicate it quickly. The Chinese government and policies, they're far different from most countries worldwide, and their COVID policies are as well. When other countries sought to open up after locking down, China went hard in the opposite direction. People with COVID were placed under quarantine at government facilities or forced to isolate in their homes. And right now, the country's largest quarantine camp in China is being built in Guangzhou City. It has 90,000 isolation pods. Internment work and re-education camps are also unfortunately common in China. Some of the other rules of China's lockdown are that all non-food shops must close in areas where infection rates are high. Businesses and schools are being closed. Mass mandatory testing is carried out in places where COVID has been reported, and lockdowns must occur until no new cases are reported. And this all happens if only a handful of cases are even reported. Local authorities implement these strict lockdowns, and you don't want to be a local authority in China. It's not uncommon for mistakes to be made by local authorities or for things to fail to work, as they sometimes do. And this can lead to the local authority being in prison or replaced. There has to be tremendous pressure to get it right, but there's also broad autonomy to implement policies as one sees fit. So local leaders sometimes implement policy without fully understanding everything there is to know. This leads to, as you can guess, some pretty heavy-handed draconian policies like randomly testing people in the streets or roadblocks or mass spraying and fumigation with unknown disinfectants, forcing workers to sleep in factories, even chaining exits to buildings and locking people inside indefinitely. So for a moment, reflect on the uncertainty and anxiety of the early days of COVID in your country or region. Perhaps you were encouraged to stay home or wear a mask for a period of time. Some Chinese citizens have been forced under penalty of imprisonment to endure far stricter draconian measures for over 2 years. The final thing to understand about China's dynamic COVID-0 policy is that it's a transitional strategy. As harsh as it all is, it is the second step adopted after containment has been achieved. It makes you wonder if you would even know some of the harsher measures being taken before dynamic COVID-0 policies take effect. Number 2, size and scale. The second thing to understand when news sources seek to amplify the actual situation in the streets is the size and scale of these demonstrations. Tens of millions have been under some kind of lockdown for over 2 years, so the streets are not as crowded as one might imagine. These protests are relatively small in comparison to the overall population. In Shanghai, an estimated 300 people demonstrated. Shanghai is a city of over 26 million. And it's difficult to know whether these protests have any lasting impact or result in any change. The Chinese government did ease up some on the restrictions in light of them, but the draconian zero COVID policies, they continue. Plants and factories in these key metropolises will run at a diminished capacity or remain closed. Workers at a factory in Zhengzhou, which makes iPhones, forced their way out a walkout because they feared being locked inside the plant. We only hear about incidents like these because it's an iPhone factory, and we're left to wonder where other incidents like these may actually occur. Plus, Zhengzhou is a city of over 10 million. And our first inclination is to think that a factory with maybe a few hundred workers isn't as symbolic of a more significant social upheaval. Here we have to put this in its proper scale. The Foxconn factory where this occurred has hundreds of thousands of staff across its sprawling industrial facility. It's one of the largest industrial factories in the world. They actually have dormitories where many of the workers live. It's enormous but small compared to the overall size of Zhengzhou. Still, you would think that such a significant event would spread across China, and people would know about it and maybe react to the news themselves, but you would be wrong in thinking that. Number 3, total control. China has an iron grip on information. Protests coordinated to date have been communicated through dating apps, social media apps, and some limited messaging services. Google, YouTube, Facebook, Wikipedia, Reddit, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitch, LinkedIn, and 100 or more other services that you might be familiar with, they're all blocked in China. Censors actively suppress not only the news, but the means to spread the news as well. There's also a COVID app required for movement in some areas. This means that you can't travel to certain areas which you only find out about from your smartphone. You could, and there are some cases where this happened, individuals receive an alert that you are immediately required to return or stay home or quarantine yourself. And several people who sought to participate in the bank protests a few months ago, they suddenly received these alerts when they were en route to protest locations. Strangely, they hadn't even recently taken a COVID test. Chinese citizens in these large cities aren't going to evade one of these orders either. In many major cities, surveillance cameras are equipped with biometric scanners on every corner. Arrests are made, people can disappear forever, and the authoritarian government erases history. People are put in prison simply for criticizing the president or government. So obviously it's an understatement to say that it's a very controlled environment. While some free movement and expression are permitted, for the most part, it is suppressed by any means necessary if it even remotely reflects negatively on the government or president. Number 4, history. You don't have to look too far back into China's history to understand the lengths the government will go to maintain control of its people in the narrative. Many in the West will remember the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. You may even recall the iconic Tank Man who, with shopping bags in hand, defiantly stood in front of the column of tanks leaving Tiananmen Square after the Chinese government's violent crackdown on protesters. Who was Tank Man? Nobody really knows. He was never heard from again. Show a picture of the iconic moment to any citizen in China under 30 years of age, and they probably will not be able to tell you anything about the moment. These who do know anything, the older people who lived through it perhaps, will probably refuse to say anything about it. While protests are rising and even calling for China's President Xi Jinping to step down, they're calm compared to the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Protests in China, even relatively peaceful and calm ones, are met with a forceful rebuke by the military and the Communist Party. Protests today are contained. Already officials are looking for and arresting known instigators of recent protests. And the difference between the events of 1989 and what's happening today is that the Chinese government's ability to leverage technology to identify, control, and even prosecute its people is genuinely dystopian at this point. So you would think all of this iron-fisted control, the lockdowns, the forced testing, the mass arrests, random checks on the streets, and all the other things they do would lead to some outraged citizens. Wrong again. According to the Pew Research Institute, Chinese citizen satisfaction with the government has consistently ranged above 85%. In contrast, America's trust in the United States government has ranged from 37 to 40%. In China, surrendering individual rights for the collective good is considered a citizen's responsibility. Plus, you don't know what you don't know. You might see that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but you would never know if the fence was a solid 10-foot wall. It's doubtful anyone in the next city over has any news or knowledge of what occurred in the Zhengzhou walkout. Other regions in China have no idea that there was even an apartment fire in Urumqi. We shouldn't solely examine the current protests in China with just Western eyes or from a purely Western perspective. China is a very different beast. Number 5, the true results. Sadly, these protests will not likely result in any real change for the Chinese people. Time will tell if I'm wrong with this assertion, but history will probably support that position. These protests, they could easily flare up to something even more substantial, leading to serious regime challenges for the communist government. There's always that possibility, but I don't think the conditions are right for that just yet. We have to zoom out a bit to see the ramifications of dynamic COVID-0 policies in China and the ongoing social unrest. The ongoing lockdowns and series of civil unrest, they're going to hurt the economy. The Chinese government has already revised its GDP. Exports momentum has faded, and imports reflect sluggish demand. The economy is rebounding slower than it would like, and the unemployment numbers amongst the younger generations are increasing. That would ripen the conditions for civil unrest if not contained. Economically, China, they can afford to kick the can down the road when it comes to severe economic collapse. This is a topic that we covered on this channel a few months back. So while these lockdowns in major cities put a severe drag on production, China still accounts for almost a third of everything manufactured worldwide. It's also finding new markets and new demands in Russia. Xi Jinping and Putin agreed to a no-limits partnership the month before Russia invaded Ukraine. For Russia, this agreement is critical, and for China, it's situational. Russia just recently presented India with a list of over 500 more items it needs to be manufactured and delivered, including parts for cars, pistons, oil pumps, ignition coils, seatbelts, aircraft, train parts, communication systems, fuel systems, fire extinguisher systems, and much more. The sanctions are taking a toll on Russia as it expends resources in its invasion in Ukraine. And just as Russia has sought to source manufacturing from India, they have aggressively pursued the same from China. Russia has partnered with China to prop up the ruble and circumvent the SWIFT system. And many Russians can now secure Chinese yuan from their bank instead of rubles. Total transactions in the yuan-ruble pair on the Moscow exchange ballooned to an average of almost 9 billion yuan, or $1.25 billion, a day last month. Previously, they rarely exceeded 1 billion yuan in an entire week. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, it wasn't even in the top 15 countries using the yuan outside of China. Now it's number 4, right behind Hong Kong. And this growing China-Russia relationship is stoking the Chinese economy and currency, keeping both countries above water. This developing relationship and the total control and suppression of the Chinese people is really going to prevent any meaningful long-term outcome from the protests. The dynamic COVID-0 policies probably won't work in the big scheme of things. At best, it will slow the infection rate to allow the healthcare system not to be overwhelmed and the population to begin to hopefully form some natural immunity. In a country where work camps are not unheard of, these protests of a few hundred people aren't likely to derail the economy too much. In the big picture, not much will probably come of them, and they will collectively be forgotten about, unfortunately, in the future. Suppose regime change occurs in Russia, or international pressure slows or prevents the flow of money and goods to Russia from China. In that case, there's the possibility things could worsen for the Chinese economy, unemployment rates, and other indicators enough to fuel larger flare-ups in response to harsh, draconian, dynamic COVID-0 policies. But that is a lot of ifs. The immediate recognizable impact is a considerable drag on the global economy that lockdowns and protests create. I wouldn't expect much else to change internally for China, and it's not likely that these protests will flare up out of control. I would expect the supply chains to become further strained. I would expect the Chinese economy to struggle a bit more, and I would expect the global dependency on almost 30% of the products manufactured in China to be examined. More and more countries will look to source materials and products from other countries or begin to do so within their own borders. On our end, we're going to continue to monitor the situation, and I think some disruptions and strains of the supply chains are inevitable if the protests get worse. But sadly, I don't see any significant advancement for the Chinese people. Even though the mainstream media will probably try to hype this up as cataclysmic or another Arab Spring, I don't see it genuinely rising to that level. Of course, these things are fluid, so we're going to have to watch it closely, but we will watch it knowing and understanding these 5 things that I've outlined in the video. Is what is happening in China a possible regime changer? What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, stay safe out there.